Hey, readers. Welcome to another day of reading activities. First of all, we just read chapter 2 of Number the Stars. What a story we've got coming along with us today. So, a really important thing that I want to talk to you about today when it comes to reading historical fiction is thinking across timelines, thinking across what is going on in the world during this time of my story. So, let me help and paint a little picture for you. So, I am thinking about like big events in histories and especially how like these historical events create these cause effect relationships that play a role in our characters and the stories we read or sometimes even write for historical fiction. So I remember back when I was in college, I had this friend that read this book that you see on the screen here. It was a book about a girl, Malala, and she actually was the one that wrote the story. So I remember talking to her about it, and she was kind of telling me about what happened in the story. And it was about this girl, Malala, who was living in an area during, like, right around the time of September 11th. Um, so this book kind of got me thinking about people's lives who were changed by historical events when I really thought about this book. And I've even had some conversations with some of you guys about like people's lives in these timelines and thinking about putting yourself in their shoes. So this girl, Malala, was such a survivor in her time period way back around that 2001. She stood up to the Taliban, some terrorists that were living in her area, so girls could go to school in Pakistan. And at that time, they weren't allowed to go to the school. So she wrote about how after September 11th, the Taliban started spending more time in her village and how she really worked hard to get the rights for the girls to go to school. She was even actually shot by the Taliban in the head, I believe, and survived and really fights for people's rights. So it's a really powerful story. It's really great. And it kind of reminds me and lets me know that there's so many parts of history and history alters people's lives. If the Taliban had never come to where she was living, Malala wouldn't have experienced these things. So I want to remind you that history is made up of so many big things that happen in a society and a country. And as you read historical fiction, you're going to be really aware of some of those historical events and especially their impacts on the people during these lives and how it ripples into other events and other ways that people live and make decisions in their life. So I want you to think about timelines as you read, especially at the beginning of your stories, because the beginning is where it's really going to set the scene and let you know about the time period. So to understand someone, a character, it's important to know their way the timeline intersects of their life with the historical events of their time. It kind of helps you understand their perspective a little bit more. So let me show you what I mean from that. So I have on the screen here a little bit of a personal timeline. These are some of the events that have happened in my life. And even on the next page, I'm going to add a couple of more. So I have the year I was born and then some like major events that happened in my life. I moved. I started fourth grade in 2003. In 2010, I got my first job. And I'll even show you on the next page, I have some other events that I thought of even after I made this first draft, if you will. I remember my sister being born, my little sister, which was like a really big event for me. And I also remember starting to work here at Oriole Lane in Mequon and when my brother was born. So all of those events are important, but I also want to think about what was going on in history at the time that I was living through some of these events. So now I have two timelines here, my personal on top and a historical timeline below. So once again, take a look at what we have here. I was born in 1997. My brother was born. We moved. That was big. I started fourth grade, which was my favorite year of school. In 2010, I got my first job. A year later, my baby sister was born. I started working my first job after college at a school called Horace Mann. And then a couple years later, I started here at Oriole Lane. But then I'm thinking about the historical timeline of big events that happened during my lifetime, and it kind of helped me realize why and how certain things happened the way that they did. So a year after I was born, there was a new president that was elected again. Then in 2001, the September 11th attacks happened. And now I'm starting to make some connections with the historical timeline and my personal timeline. I totally forgot, and probably could also add, like, my first time going to Disney World, which was actually a couple years after 2001. And now I'm realizing, like, wow, when I went to Disney World, I remember my parents like talking about packing and making sure we were putting right things in our suitcases, because after that, they really cracked down on the rules at the airports and were very restrictive of things that you could take. The same year that I started fourth grade is when the Space Shuttle Columbia incident occurred. I thought this was interesting. The first iPhone came out in 2007, I found as I researched important events of the past. So I was around before iPhones came out. So sometimes you guys tell me things and I'm like, what? I just remember when the iPhone came out, like technology wasn't a big thing for me. How does that shape who I am? Right. Then we have like Barack Obama being elected. We have the year Michael Jackson passed away. And even more recently, that coronavirus pandemic. I think that's going to be a huge event in all of our timelines on how things changed for us and how history impacted our personal timeline and sometimes impacted the way that we make decisions and do things in life. So you later are going to make your own personal historical timeline and kind of check in on like what was going on during my lifetime. Can I think of how that maybe changed things? But we're also going to connect this to what we've read so far in the story Number the Stars. So take a look at some of the things I have already included for you. So when we think of Number the Stars, I'm going back to like chapter 1 even. The year was 1943. That was when Anne Marie was stopped by that soldier and her sister was running down the street behind her. That's where our story kind of started, right? In history, in real history, true facts, 1943 was the same year that people in Denmark that were Jewish were starting to be captured and taken and put in concentration camps. So now I'm like, oh, that really makes sense that Anne Marie and Ellen were so scared, and why her mom was like, you need to take another way home from school. Like, that, it makes sense now. When I kind of think about history even before that, just the year before, Hitler recalled the German ambassador from Denmark. So we see that Hitler is starting to take a little bit more control of the area of Denmark as well. So as I'm realizing what's happening in history during this time period, it really helps me understand why my characters are behaving and acting in the way that they do. So I did a little research and I was like, well, what happened before that? So even before 1942, in 1940, that is when Denmark was invaded by Germany. So that was the year that we makes sense, because at this point in 1943, Anne Marie mentioned in first chapter that they'd been there for 3 years. So when I think about other things that happened that we read about recently in these chapters, we have Papa telling Anne Marie that story about King Christian, right? So that happened before this. And then we also learned, whoopsie daisy, we also learned that unfortunately, there was another character that we never got to meet. Before this happened too, Anne Marie's older sister Lisa's killed. We don't totally know what happened yet, but I'm trying to look at these timelines and see, like, Anne Marie's sister was killed after Denmark was invaded. It doesn't seem like it was too long ago, or it might have been where like Hitler started taking even more control. I'm starting to see, like, is there a connection that the story hasn't told us yet or done a lot of work to really help us make yet, right? And that is why the historical timeline is so important, to get to know the time period of what's happening to really understand your characters. So you're going to continue working on reading for your book clubs today. And as you read, just kind of keep in the back of your mind, like what is happening in the world of your character that's causing them to believe this way. So really think to yourself about your time period and maybe consider the time period when it comes to thinking about decisions that your character is making.